The vote is the most powerful instrument ever devised by man for breaking down injustice and destroying the terrible walls which imprison men because they're different from other men.
There are people who died for the right to vote. There are people who got their heads beat in on the Edmund Pettus Bridge for the right to vote. We cannot turn back. We have to keep going forward.
Tough new measures mandating that voters produce photo identification.
16 states have passed or enacted a variety of poll access laws.
There is what looks very much like a coordinated effort among Republican legislatures and Republican governors to pass laws making it significantly harder to vote.
Democracy NC, the NAACP, and voting rights groups across the state believe that the new voting legislation is a response to the upsurge of minority and youth voting in the 2008 election. They're organizing to stop these measures from becoming state law.
Our right to vote is sacred. Our right to free and fair elections is sacred. But right now in North Carolina, our rights are being threatened.
One measure pushed by North Carolina legislators would force an estimated 450,000 active voters to apply for state-issued photo ID cards. Another would make it harder to register and would limit the amount of time the polls would be open. At the same time, North Carolina's lawmakers are refusing millions of dollars in federal funds to buy voting machines and keep voting locations open.
They're trying to stop, steal, and segregate the power and the potential of the black vote.
The new laws would disproportionately reduce voting among low-income people, African Americans and Latinos, young people, and seniors.
We are a multicultural, multiracial society. That is who we are as a people. If you want to have a government that reflects the people and serves the people, you've got to have a multicultural, multiracial government.
While sponsors of North Carolina's proposed voting laws claim we need them to curb voter fraud, opponents point out that fraud is rare and argue that the real reasons lie elsewhere. They urge us to remember that today's campaign to limit the right to vote echoes one that took place over 100 years ago. Decades after the Civil War, a mortgage crisis, an economic recession, and a changing economy helped spur a surprising multiracial coalition in North Carolina. It set voter turnout records and elected an unprecedented number of African Americans to public office. A huge step forward in opening the doors of democracy to all, it met a hostile reaction that swiftly shut those doors.
During Reconstruction, there was a general collapse of the economy, and a lot of people are poor in North Carolina, black and white, from 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, and by the time you hit the 1890s, there's a real outcry for a need for change.
White farmers began to look to black farmers as possible political allies against the banks and the railroads and the rising New South industrial state. It was a really remarkable experiment in its historical moment in interracial democracy. This fusion coalition won every statewide election. It won the governor's race. It won both United States Senate seats. It never lost an election. It could not be beaten at the polls.
Nearly 1,000 African Americans were elected to county and city offices.
You have African Americans who had previously been powerless within the political context. Now they were emerging as a force with power.
The fusionists placed a 6% cap on the interest rates that banks could charge farmers. They returned vital decision-making powers to local governments. And they taxed the railroad barons and industrialists to pay for an emerging public school and university system.
African Americans coming out of slavery really wanted a viable public education system because they saw education as really crucial to advancing their interests after emancipation. And so fusionists come in and actually direct money to education. This is seen as a big, huge, incredible deal for not only African Americans but poor whites in North Carolina.
Nowhere was the fusion movement more successful than in North Carolina's largest city at the time, Wilmington.
You could see that this is what the New South could become at the beginning of the 20th century. African American children were graduating and going to college and being architects and engineers and doctors and attorneys, and they were coming back to Wilmington and doing these things, and it all stopped in 1898. It just stopped.
Wealthy landowners, merchants, and white supremacists identified with the conservative party of the day, the Democrats. With support from the Raleigh News and Observer, the Democratic leader, Furnifold Simmons, launched a relentless campaign to demonize African Americans and drive a racial wedge between them and their white allies.
To break up this interracial progressive coalition, the white conservatives, they hire propagandists, they bring in a cartoonist from New York City to show images of the black beast rapist, the incubus of Negro domination. Which was this idea that the closer that a black man gets to the ballot box, the more he looks like a rapist.
White conservatives accused fusionists of voter fraud and government corruption.
So they're creating this sort of sense of a crime wave, and they're locating that on African Americans, and they're using this as a way and justification to explain why Democrats need to retain control.
And so these cartoons ran pretty regularly in the newspaper. And we have to remember that not everyone in 1898 is literate. And if you couldn't necessarily read the entire newspaper article, you could see a cartoon and get the gist of what they're trying to get across in the paper.
In the run-up to the 1898 elections, Democrats organized vigilante brigades called Red Shirts, who patrolled the streets, menacing both white and black voters.
The white leadership made a point to have business owners tell their employees, particularly if they were black or if they were Republicans, that if you register to vote, you will lose your job.
Democrats in that period are very open about saying, look, if we're going to win, we've got to make sure people don't vote.
The Democrats swept the 1898 elections. Still, the Wilmington city government remained in the hands of the fusionists, but not for long.
Wilmington was an armed camp. The Democratic Party leadership were putting guns in the hands of every white man they could find. They were giving them whiskey. They were putting them in rallies, and they were empowering them, and they were instilling this fear of African Americans in them.
Tensions exploded over a bold editorial in an African American newspaper. A mob of 2,000 stormed the paper's office and burned it down.
They started out in the morning and marched troops into the black community and began to shoot it up, to fire just indiscriminately into the black community, causing thousands of people to flee their homes out into the woods.
The conservatives then rounded up both black and white fusion officials.
With 500 or 600 whites, all armed, and they would bring in each elected official one at a time and bring him into the middle of the crowd and sit him down in a chair, and was told, you have a choice. You can resign and leave, or we'll kill you. And then as each one of them resigned separately, they then appointed a white to take that person's place on the city council. They then marched them out right down to the train station and put them on a train.
At the end of the day, hundreds of civic and business leaders were put on trains never to return. Documents show that at least 22 African Americans were murdered, but the real death toll remains unknown.
It's the only successful coup that the United States has ever seen.
Back in power, the conservatives aimed to ensure that no such reform alliance could ever rise again. So they constructed legal barriers to make it difficult, if not impossible, for African Americans and poor whites to vote.
It said nothing about race. It didn't say black folks can't vote. It said literacy tests. It was neutral language. The grandfather clause, if your grandfather had voted, then you didn't have to take the literacy test. So It was all colorblind.
At the height of fusion, 126,000 African Americans were registered to vote in North Carolina. 2 years after the Wilmington coup, the number of registered African American voters shrank to 6,000. North Carolina's voting laws suppressed the vote for decades and blocked all kinds of reforms. In 1920, at the peak of the women's suffrage movement, Furnifold Simmons, still kingmaker of the Democratic Party, warned of a revival of fusion if North Carolina allowed women to vote. One congressman cautioned that, just for the sake of letting a few agitating white women vote, the women's suffrage amendment would enfranchise 110,000 Negro women. Tar Heel lawmakers refused to ratify the amendment, even as women won the right to vote in other states. Barriers to the vote remained until passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Again, there was a reaction from conservatives. Over the next few decades, thousands of Democratic office holders across the southern states fled their old party to become Republicans, turning it into a nearly all-white political party.
Now, I'm sorry that some of you had votes suppressed in the past. I understand that. For House Bill 351, a bill requiring that voters provide photo identification before voting.
Today, there are no red shirts menacing voters like they did in the fusion years. But conservative lawmakers again fear a surge of new voters. Again, they want to rewrite election laws to limit participation. Their anti-voter bills would repeal same-day registration, shorten early voting, end Sunday voting, and more. The justification echoes that of the 1890s.
Why? Because in the past two elections, there have been hundreds of voting irregularities. Cases of double voting and absentee voting, fraud.
Yes, voter fraud. Take Ohio. A statewide survey of votes cast in 2002 and 2004 found that out of 9,078,000 votes, there were 4 instances of fraud. That is a jaw-dropping 44/1,000,000%. Folks, our democracy is under siege from an enemy so small it could be hiding anywhere.
People have to push back against this kind of nonsense.
We're saying that these folks, the representatives in here, some of them, the leadership, are out of control.
It's a tool for them to reduce the number of eligible people that can vote. The groups that are affected, in some ways it's the same groups that were affected 100 years ago. Voting and democracy at its core is about bringing more people in. That's what Democracy North Carolina is all about.
North Carolina's anti-voter bills are hanging in the balance. History shows us that those who can seize the moment will shape our democracy for generations to come.
Mantle has been passed. We are at this point, we're at this precipice. Do we want America that should be but has never been? Now it's time to go forward. If you don't do it, accept what kind of consequences happen to you because you just rolled over and you just let it happen. I'm, for one, am not going to let that happen. I'm going to fight till I have my last breath to try to make things better.
These laws aren't designed to keep those Democrats from voting. They're designed to keep the wrong people from voting.
Why do we have these campaigns saying we have to get all the young people to vote? Young people often don't know anything. Let's stop saying everyone should vote.